Today, we're joined by Sofia Faruqi from the World Resources Institute. Sofia has worked in economics and finance throughout her career and has been working for the WRI since 2016. There, she leads the new restoration economy and created the Land Accelerator. She was the lead author on the report The Business of Tree Planting, and her work focuses on economic empowerment through business accelerators and sustainable environmental action. We caught up with Sofia to discuss her work and why business is an important tool for sustainable socio-economic development. Yeah, it seems that tree planting's really having this moment, and a lot of people are donating to tree planting and restoration. Why do you think tree planting's having this moment?
So it's a confluence of different factors. At the same time that we are seeing that there's a lot more attention coming to climate change as a major problem that we need to collectively tackle, we're also seeing a lot more interest in different solutions. And what we've seen is that renewable energy, which has long been recognized accurately as a very important solution, we're seeing that that's not the full picture, and that we're actually going to need a range of different possibilities. And the one that can actually sequester the most carbon is a tree planting. And so we're seeing at the same time that with the tree planting, we're also recognizing that in addition to the carbon potential, there are a number of business models that are emerging and a number of innovative approaches that people are experimenting with and that are really promising.
So what are the other benefits beyond the carbon capture that trees can provide for an environment?
Biodiversity is a big one. We also see a lot of benefits for food security. So, for example, farmers who plant trees using what's often called an agroforestry model, where you incorporate trees in addition to your existing crops, that tends to boost crop yields sometimes by almost double, which if you're talking about subsistence farmers, suddenly producing double the food makes a big difference to your family's bottom line.
Can you explain the agroforestry model a little bit more?
Sure. So agroforestry usually consists of incorporating trees on agricultural lands. So what we often see is that farmers may be planting, say, legumes on their plots and maize. And then they'll say, okay, our crops, our soil is no longer of high quality, and our crop yields have been declining for years. So how about we also add some trees? So they don't replace the crops they're planting, they just also plant trees in addition to the crops. And what we see is that the roots of the trees help to bind the soil together so that in times of rain, they don't see as much soil erosion. And then as the tree planting efforts increase, we also see a return of biodiversity, with farmers noticing that birds that they haven't seen in years are suddenly coming back, with bee populations increasing as well. And also other plant life starts to emerge too. So it sets off a virtual cycle which incorporates the local communities, the plants, the animals, and also the economy through the improved food security.
You wrote a report for WRI in 2018 called The Business of Planting Trees, and I saw that it was the most viewed WRI report that year. And in it, you mentioned a lot of times the restoration economy. What is the restoration economy, or the new restoration economy?
So the new restoration economy is all about delivering environmental and financial returns through restoration. And the way this happens is through businesses such as those featured in the report, which are essentially finding ways to make money while restoring forests and farmland. One example of that is Brinkman, which is a Canadian company that has planted over 1 billion trees to date. Essentially, Brinkman's clients Brinkman plants trees so that its clients are then able to comply with the law, which requires that companies must reforest any areas where timber extraction takes place. So in peak season, which is the summer, around 1,000 tree planters work for Brinkman across Canada.
And is it always kind of private enterprise that you focus on when you talk about the restoration economy?
We do usually focus on private enterprises. And the reason we do that is that we see that the private sector is going to be essential to scale up the financing that is needed. And for that private investment to flow, we actually need viable business models. And that is why we've been focused so far primarily on the private sector business models. But that's not to say that that's the only important thing, because there's so many local nonprofits that are doing absolutely phenomenal and very essential work.
So obviously, Brinkman's a really large corporation. What's it look like on the more smaller side of things, the smaller scale businesses that are planting trees?
So we see so many companies, for example, in Africa. We've had 26 companies now go through the Land Accelerator, all in Africa, which is the world's first business accelerator focused on land restoration. So we see most of these companies work in sustainable agriculture with smallholder farmers. For example, they may be selling organic fertilizers that are customized for African soils that help to boost smallholder farmer yields. We're now also expanding to South Asia and Latin America, and we're curious to see what types of innovation we find there. Usually it's about, for example, we've also seen a lot of tree-based innovations, basically in different supply chains. So, for example, how do you plant trees rather than through a plantation model, through an outgrower model that includes farmers? That's been a beneficial approach we've seen as well. In terms of other models, for example, in the US, one company we were impressed by is Guayaki, which grows yerba mate in the Atlantic rainforest in Argentina. Yerba mate grows in the shade of the forest. So that means the company also plants a lot of native hardwood trees in addition to the yerba mate. And when the harvest is done, it then translates this into beverages targeted toward American consumers. So really an approach that's grown fast in the market and consumers have responded very positively to. And at the same time, something where the local farmers in Argentina are able to make up to 2 times the market rate and are essentially guided on best practices to do this restoration work sustainably.
So yeah, could you expand on like the numbers? What are the kinds of benefits for every dollar that gets spent on these projects? What kind of benefits do the local communities see?
So research at a wider level indicates that each $1 invested in tree-based restoration generates up to $30 in economic benefits. And this captures the broad range of benefits we see, from the carbon to the food security to the soil enhancements to the improved air quality. So really the benefits are quite staggering, and they're very inclusive as well because they flow to the whole community.
And does that kind of vary region to region, or is that the mean across all of the projects?
It does vary. And it's hard to say, for example, where is it higher and where is it lower, because it also depends on the type of restoration you do, how long-term the projects are, how many people live in those areas. So there are quite a few factors.
How important is it to use business and the markets as a force for good, and specifically in terms of land use and farming?
So business and the markets are very essential when we start to think about scale. And that's because ultimately with businesses and the markets, the profits the companies generate and the capital they can attract from investors will enable them to grow much faster versus local initiatives that are constantly relying on donations. So as we start to think about the large scale that is needed in order for us to actually stay on a 2-degree pathway, that's where the business and the private sector starts to become more and more important.
And then like the use of cash crops. So you mentioned yerba mate in Brazil. or say coffee in Kenya or Rwanda or somewhere. Why do we plant these plants? Why can't we restore these ecosystems to how they were to a pre-human age?
So there's a whole debate about should we be trying to go back to past ecosystems, or should we be instead aiming for what are called novel ecosystems, which are going to look different from the past? So not to get in the center of that debate, but essentially the more it's very hard to make the argument that we should remove people who depend on the land for their lives, and that instead we should create a forest there. Once that land is now converted to agriculture, it's really hard to then go back once people are actually living there. So probably among the most important things we can do is prevent the further deforestation and actually preserve all remaining forests as intact. Because once they're gone, you're right, it's very hard to go back.
You mentioned earlier the Land Accelerator program. From what I understand, you were instrumental in starting that program. Could you explain what the program is?
The Land Accelerator is the world's first business accelerator focused on companies that restore forests and farmland. We've had 2 cohorts in Africa so far and are expanding to regional programs in Latin America and South Asia in the next few months. We essentially work with small and medium enterprises to connect them with business and technical training, investor matchmaking, and also mentoring. We found actually that this is a very crucial combination that enables many of them to be, when they're at a very critical inflection point in terms of growth, to enable them to get over the hump and to be able to, from that point, raise money, hire more people, attract investors, and also scale up their restoration efforts. So, for example, we found that companies that participated in our Africa cohort in 2018, in the 12 months after they completed the accelerator, they actually doubled their employment on average. And we expect to continue to see such benefits for the local communities and for the ecosystems in our other regions as well. And we're currently accepting applications for South Asia as well as Africa.
What are the range of restoration businesses that are involved in the accelerator? Is it, only nurseries? Is it only tree planting companies? Or like what kind of range do you see?
It can be, we're not too prescriptive because we understand that the space is rapidly evolving and we want to be part of that innovation. So what we end up seeing are, for example, usually companies that are meeting the local needs. That's a big part of them actually being profitable. And so, for example, if the local needs are around tree-based crops, then that's what we'll see. But if the local needs are around improvements in, say, the supply chain for a cocoa to make it more sustainable, then we'll see more innovations around that. In the US and Europe context, we tend to see ideas around technologies for planting trees and different ways to monitor the recovery of forests as well. So it really depends on that local context that we're working with and where do the companies actually see commercial demand. So demand has to meet supply at the end of the day for these companies to work.
So yeah, how do you guys identify what the local need is and who the key stakeholders are in that region?
We don't actually, so we're not very top down. So for example, we don't say that the local need here is to increase the scale of agroforestry by 10 times in the next 5 years or anything like that. Instead, we see what are the ideas coming in and what are the trends among those and where are we seeing traction. So for example, we look for the companies that are able to, say, double their sales every year and that have shown a pattern of doing this. And we look for companies that have already built strong teams of people who are executing around a common vision. We look for entrepreneurs who have a strong sense of purpose and who derive great meaning from the work they're doing through their companies. So those are the types of things we tend to look for as opposed to any specific market or intervention. In our first cohort, we had Mavis Nadujva join us from Botswana. And she was actually initially working on a business centered around animal feed. And the idea being that Botswana exports a lot of beef, but imports all its animal feed. And so there's clearly something out of whack in this balance. But then after she joined the Land Accelerator, a big part of what we do is actually have entrepreneurs think deeply about, am I even tackling the right problem? And do I have the right solution? And is this solution something that can actually work in the marketplace? So through that iterative process, Mavis actually ended up changing her business. So she moved away from the animal feed and instead went into honey. And there she saw that there was a strong global market that she could tap into in terms of a customer base. And she also realized that actually there's a much stronger link to a conservation there. Because in the local communities where she was working, there was a significant conflict in terms of elephants coming and trampling the land of smallholder farmers, which would then create this sort of tension between elephants continuing to live there. And it turns that elephants hate bee stings as much as anybody else. So by incorporating essentially beehives on the farm plots, it was a very effective way of keeping the elephants away and at the same time creating income opportunities for local women while enabling Kalahari Honey, as the new business is called, to significantly increase its revenues.
So it's interesting. It sounds like the Land Accelerator is a lot more than just sort of like a funding model. It seems like there's a lot of support offered and sort of business planning that goes involved with the businesses who sign up.
Yeah, that's right. We are really looking to partner with these companies on their journeys and to help them however we can to grow and to create more impact in this world.
And then how does a partnership that One Tree Planted has with WRI, how does that kind of partnership feed into your work with the Land Accelerator?
Well, we really respect One Tree Planted and are absolutely amazed by the great work you guys do every day. And we are optimistic that One Tree Planted could become a catalyst for more people who are looking to just get out there and do something and have some impact. Because we find that too often there's this idea that, okay, the challenge is so big. How can I be part of the solution? But ultimately, each of us can be part of the solution. And I think that's what you guys show so clearly, that you don't need to be a millionaire and you don't need to be a genius. You really just need to be passionate about the problem and willing to do something about it.
How do we get more young people involved, the next generation of people? They already seem to be particularly active and informed about the challenges that we're facing as a global population. But how do we get more of them involved in the type of work that you do?
So One Tree Planted is a great way for people to think, okay, what can I do as an individual, and to start to get involved. We also see that individuals can get involved. For example, now is actually a great time to be thinking of a business idea in this space. There's so many problems we're facing on the environmental and climate front, and anything that could help us to even at a very small scale, make a difference is at the end of the day, if that's what you spend your time doing, that is time very well spent. I think people, I know we talk a lot about scale at WRI, and of course, scale is very important. But at the same time, it can also be intimidating for someone to think, well, if my idea doesn't become, result in a million trees, then why am I doing this? But ultimately, each tree you plant is now going to be there for future generations. And it does make a difference. I've planted trees in the local DC community, and every time I go by there, I look for them, and I'm happy. I'm happy to see them.
And as you said, there's that. Yeah, go on, Joe.
I'm just wondering if you saw a similar global response to these needs. Are there lots of, in developing countries, let's say, lots of entrepreneurs young entrepreneurs who are thinking about entering this new restoration economy?
There are. We've been amazed by how many entrepreneurs are in the space, because when we opened up the call to applications for the Land Accelerator, we ended up receiving around 600 applications from across Africa. And now our call for South Asia is still open, and we've already crossed the 200 mark, even though it's a brand new program there. So we're constantly amazed by just how many passionate people are working on different ways of essentially growing more trees and improving soil and creating benefits for their local communities. At the same time, a lot of these are early stage. And there's definitely going to be room for a lot more innovation. So we see it as a space where there's already been a lot of good traction, but we're still in the early days. And it's a good time to join the movement. Ultimately, as an entrepreneur, it is still a fairly wide open space with a lot of opportunities. But at the same time, because we're already starting to see business models emerge, entrepreneurs can benefit from learning about what is already happening. So they're not starting from scratch. They're starting with some idea of what will or will not work in the market. And they're also starting at a time when we are seeing tons of interest from governments and from large companies that could very well become the new startups' clients.
In the business of planting trees, you mentioned the most effective form of carbon capture is trees. What would a carbon capture business look like that utilizes trees?
So we haven't actually seen too many businesses that are focused on the carbon capture element. And actually, that is one of those wide open spaces that we just talked about. It's an area where currently for companies or for projects to actually measure how much carbon they're capturing, it tends to be an expensive and long process.
Yeah.
So there's actually so much room for innovation here, for new approaches to think, okay, how do we do this quickly and cheaply? And even getting that data would then be so supportive of having a functioning and thriving carbon markets, which would then become a whole new source of finance for this whole space.
Looking now at the COVID-19, the health crisis that's going on now, what positives can you envisage the other side of this for the economy or for the green economy or for the work that you're doing with the Land Accelerator?
So we actually see that a number of successful companies tend to come out of recessions. And it might also just be a matter of only the strongest survives. If you manage through a recession, then it may speak well to your business. So actually, it'll be really great to see what types of green innovations come out of the next couple of years. And because at the same time, to succeed in this in a tough market, you have to often be able to get by with very limited investor funding. And also, you need to have a very compelling pitch to your customers about why they should be signing on for a brand new product at a time when their incomes might be falling. So actually, as a business, it's a good time to really test yourself and to test your ideas if you have something in mind but haven't actually started yet. So in that sense, even having more free time can be a good way to just get testing.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us, Sophia.
And also say bye to the cat for us too.
Oh yes, now she's fast asleep after
Of course.
creating havoc. Exactly. Okay, bye everyone.
Okay, great chatting.
Wow,
Thanks so
thank
much.
you.